You're listening to 17 Carat K-Pop, the podcast that's a little bit of everything with a K-pop twist. From pop culture critiques to the history of K-pop to interviews with people in the K-pop industry and K-pop artists themselves, to concert and album reviews, to a deep dive into the discographies of different K-pop artists, to K-pop news updates, to stories about the music industry more broadly. This show tries to cover everything about K-pop and K-pop as it applies to the larger music and concert scenes. Visit 17caratkpop.weebly.com for more information about the show. That's 17caratkpop.weebly.com. Hello everybody and welcome back to 17 Carat K-Pop. We are starting a series of episodes, and don't worry, I will still have other episode themes interspersed throughout the releases of these, so if you're not into BTS, you will still hopefully find some interesting episodes in the next few weeks. But anyway, we are still starting a new series of episodes, diving into the literary and cinematic influences on BTS, the pieces they have directly referenced as being a source of inspiration. And we have to start with Demian by Hermann Hesse, a German novel from 1919 that still has so much resonance a century later. This was a big influence on BTS's Blood, Sweat, and Tears music video, as well as all of their Wings era videos, and I think you'll see their videos in a brand new light once we dive into the characters, the symbols and themes, and really interesting thought-provoking quotes from this book. So all things Demian are what we're talking about today, and please know in advance, I apologize if I butcher any of these German character names, but what I have heard is it's Demian, even though it's spelled Demian. It is a coming-of-age story set right before World War I. It is divided between what's called the realm of day and the realm of night. These worlds are more so symbolic. It's not like literally, physically, the main character walks into the other world, but it's just an important, ever-present theme in the story, as well as the influence of imaginary friends, and it's all ultimately a psychoanalysis about the main character, the narrator's psyche and evolution as he's growing up. Who are the characters who influence his views on the world as he grows up? What are their values? And it's all in hindsight. The narrator's talking in hindsight about things that he wished he had known then, or things he thinks about differently now. It's a running dialogue of all sorts about growing up and intellectually evolving. So it's a really deep philosophical book, but it also has an interesting, just surface level plot that's kind of just quirky and interesting. But at the end of the day, it has some really deep, important, insightful quotes that speak to why BTS wanted to use this work as inspiration, because they have very similar themes and social commentary in their work as well, and I think that will be clearer as we go. Without further ado, let's break down who the main characters are and then get to the plot. Emil Sinclair is the main character in this story. He's also the narrator, and it's an older version of him, so old Sinclair is narrating the story of young Sinclair and constantly interjects into the story to add his own commentary, his thoughts, his critiques of his previous worldview, his analysis. It's ultimately all one big psychoanalysis of himself. So the story is not exactly immersive in the sense that you are constantly snapped out of the action to hear what this narrator has to say about what was happening. So it's a running dialogue. The story starts with him being age 10, and he is just like a 10-year-old. He's very, very emotionally immature and immature in any other way. He's your classic 10-year-old. He's got a lot to learn for sure. But he's at this very impressionable stage of life where he is influenced greatly by what his teachers say, what his parents say, and then what any students or others in his life say that contradicts what his teachers and parents have been saying. So he's just his views are very malleable at this point in his life as he hears these different narratives and tries to figure out where he agrees and disagrees. Then there is Max Damian, he says he's the son of this rich widow, and he's now a classmate of Sinclair's. He is all in Sinclair's head this whole time. He's a figment of his imagination in a way, but he's this guiding force in his life, and is very real to him. So treat this character as you would a real character. Despite what I just told you to help clear some things up, also keep in mind that Damian is very, very real to Sinclair as he grows up. So anyway, Demian allows Sinclair to continuously question what he's being taught. He is that force, that peer who's not necessarily an example of peer pressure, but just peer influence, and provoking this emotional development in Sinclair as he grows up. Rather than just let him blindly believe what he's been taught, he challenges him, and they have really rigorous intellectual discussions. Frau Eva is Damian's mom. Interestingly, later on in the story when they first meet, Demian reveals that before she met Sinclair, she would never disclose her name on the first visit, but she did for him, which made him feel very special and loved. Forevermore, they had this really close bond, and in a way, she kind of balanced out what Demian would do, because Demian was kind of just a friend or a brother to Sinclair, while she was a more motherly force. So they could show him different kinds of love and affection and different kinds of influence that would kind of balance each other out in some ways. Pistorius is this organ player who Sinclair grows quite fond of. We'll talk more about him later, but he's the organ player in the story, and he also has these intellectually deep, rigorous conversations with Sinclair. Franz Kromer is the school bully. Franz is the one who blackmails Sinclair in the story. We will get to him in a minute. Lastly, there is Beatrice, who Sinclair grows to love. He's really just fascinated by this person. Don't know if her real name is Beatrice. He just calls her that. He decides her name is Beatrice and he wants to pursue her romantically. Chapter 1 starts out with Sinclair talking with some boys about the worst things they've ever done. And they're trying to one-up each other as young boys do, talking about the most rebellious things they've ever done. And Sinclair decides that he doesn't have a good enough thing to share with them. So he makes up a whole elaborate story about a time he stole a bag of apples. After they tell these stories, Kromer pulls Sinclair aside and they're speaking privately later. He says, well, if you're an apple thief, I'm going to tell on you now. And it's an interesting moment where you have to stop and remember that Sinclair is this young, innocent 10-year-old, and Kromer is the bully. So Kromer knows he's emotionally manipulating the situation to pretend that he does totally believe Sinclair. And Sinclair believes that he really did steal the bag of apples, that he bought his story. He didn't, but Kromer's acting like he did buy the story and is going to tell on Sinclair now. So he says, I'm going to turn you in because there's reward money out for whoever has a lead on the story, and I'm going to tell them it was you. I'm going to turn you in. They end up reaching this agreement where Sinclair says, don't turn me in, your lips are sealed, and I will pay you to stay silent. So the next day they agree to meet in the market, and he will be paid. Sinclair finds money in his piggy bank that will suffice, but is not exactly the amount they agreed on. So he shows up the next day and shows Kromer the amount of money he does have, which isn't enough to please Kromer. And so Kromer has this long period of time where he just keeps making Sinclair do favors for him and do embarrassing things to make up for the financial money. Now he has to pay in another way to make up for the total. Sinclair is at his wit's end with this, and one day things really just take the turn for the worst because Kromer says, look, I'm getting a little bored of these antics. Give me your sister. We'll call it a day, and the final challenge for you will be to just give me your sister. Sinclair has no idea what that means he'll do to her. What happens in the midst of this blackmail scheme is that Sinclair and Demian meet for the first time in school, and they strike up a conversation about what they were talking about in the day's lecture, which is the biblical story of Cain and Abel, who are contrasted characters as like the ultimate sign of devilishness versus purity. Sinclair basically just regurgitates what his teacher told him to interpret the story as meaning, and Demian encourages him to expand his view of the story and argues in a different way, like maybe you could think of the story as actually having that meaning instead, leaving Sinclair in a lot of thought, for just the first time of many that Demian would do that for him. When Sinclair tells Demian about this whole blackmail situation, Demian encourages Sinclair to do something that Sinclair, in hindsight, should have thought of but never did, which is, how about just don't answer him? Just don't bring your sister to him. What is he going to do? He actually doesn't have the power over you that you think he does. So it's quite radical just to stand up that way for himself, but Sinclair feels like he's going to give it a try. And then when a few weeks go by, Kromer dodges him and looks scared to see him and runs across the street, seems to want to get out of his sight. So Sinclair now thinks Demian is this godly person, some superhuman person with magical abilities. Like, how did you do that? How did you get my bully to leave me alone? And Demian won't say specifically why. He just says, all you had to do was just stop and think, wait, how is he making me feel like a victim when I don't have to be? As confirmation day approaches, Sinclair learns he's going to be sent off to boarding school, and when he is sent there, he's very angry and lonely. So he really craves this companionship, and in this vulnerable state, this guy named Alphonse Beck invites him to the bar to go hang out. So he goes, gets super drunk, and basically just goes on a drunken tangent about that story of Cain and Abel again. Then Sinclair becomes a regular at that bar, and he has all these drunken escapades and is just super rebellious, hanging out with the wrong crowd at college. He actually almost ends up getting expelled twice while he's there, and when he's home for the holidays, he's not the boy he used to be before boarding school. He's a changed man who is no longer homesick but irritated around his parents, and he wants to go back away from them. At this point, he lost some sort of go-getter, goody-two-shoes attitude, if he ever had one, and now is just feeling accepting of the fact that he is destined to not meet up to any standards in life. He's just not going to have a bright future, and he has just decided to accept that, and it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. When he is back home on a holiday break from the boarding school, he runs back into Demian, and Demian finds out that Sinclair has been having these drunken habits and looks very concerned and displeased with him for that new hobby. But what happens next is that Sinclair's whole worldview abruptly changes when he sees his new crush, Beatrice. Suddenly, he cleans up his act and he starts focusing more on schoolwork, he stops going to the bars, and he even takes up painting as a new hobby, a more productive hobby. Here's a really exciting part when you're reading the story if you are a BTS fan. Sinclair finds a note in his bag one day. It's unsigned, but I have a feeling based on the wording no other person would ever send him that note if it wasn't Demian, that says, quote, "The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Who would be born first must destroy a world. The bird flies to God. That God's name is Abraxas," unquote. Abraxas being this figure that's kind of godlike, but a total mix of devilish and pure qualities. We will talk more about Abraxas later. He gets that reminder from Demian even though he cleaned up his act, like there's still something he has to unpack in his psyche. As his college years get closer, Sinclair starts worrying more and more about what he's going to do with his life, because he feels like everyone around him has a concrete goal, and all he wants to do with his life is, quote, "live in accord with the promptings of his true self." Sinclair regularly finds solace in listening to this organ player at a nearby church, and decides to drop by and secretly listen in on the organ playing night after night. One night he decides that he's going to follow the organ player to the bar, or follow him wherever he goes, and that ends up with him going to the bar with him. So he ends up sitting down next to the organ player uninvited and strikes up a conversation. This is Pistorius, the organ player I mentioned earlier, and that leads to many more conversations between them, and they really open up about Abraxas and their views on good versus evil and the world in a very philosophical way. But this is an interesting dynamic because in his company, Sinclair doesn't really get pushed the way he does around Demian. He's not seeing so much a new way of looking at stuff as reinforcing his old ways of thinking and feeling encouraged. So they're still serving a constructive function in his life, these conversations, but not constructive because they push him to think differently about stuff. Just constructive because they help him boost his own confidence and sureness in what he already knows and thinks. Sinclair ends up painting someone who looks exactly like him. He has this visceral reaction in this psychological breakdown of sorts. He ends up really out of sorts. He takes a bath in the middle of the night. He goes on a midnight walk. And while he's out walking, he encounters a classmate named Naur who is about to take his own life, and he stops him from doing so. But then he kind of just leaves Naur alone. They don't really revisit that character later, but that scene is really important, and we'll get back to why later. Sinclair has a feud with Pistorius because he grows tired of him and basically says so. He calls his views outdated. He feels like, and he tells him that, "I don't think these conversations are constructive for me anymore. I'm not getting anything new from them. I've just grown wary of our conversations. They're not doing anything new for me. They're not teaching me anything." And that comment could have just been a way to talk out their differences, but that didn't happen. It just irreparably damaged the relationship. Sinclair does decide to study philosophy and go off to college. He, though, ends that chapter 6 we're talking about now, saying he, quote, "cannot take another step alone." He's really ashamed to admit that, though. So he contemplates telling Demian and confessing, "Hey, can we go back to talking regularly, or can you give me advice or something?" But he feels too nervous to admit that he is nervous about this new chapter of his life. So he's just dealing with those feelings on his own. Sinclair tries to visit Demian once and goes to his address, only to learn that he no longer lives there. The current occupant does try to help him find him, but no luck. But Sinclair happens to run into Demian again when they're both in college, and they reunite very happily and go back to deep conversations like no time has passed at all. This is when Sinclair finally meets Demian's mom, who says he can call her Frau Eva. Sinclair from then on out continues to routinely visit this household, kind of like it's his own. He just comes and goes as he pleases and really loves their company. He starts having a very lovely summer hanging out with these two, when one day he hears talk of an impending war with Russia. Demian says, "I think I will have to enlist soon," and sure enough he does. And shortly after, Sinclair goes off to war as well. This is when Sinclair enters some sort of dreamlike state, so it's unclear how much is reality and how much isn't. He sees, while he's in this dreamlike state at war, an image of Ava in the sky, and she has what they call the Mark of Cain. Remember Cain from the Cain and Abel story, the symbol of evil? She has the Mark of Cain on her, and that Mark of Cain on Ava has this star that shoots Sinclair while he's in this haze of sorts. So he comes to, and he has this injury on the battlefield. So basically what happens is he kind of went into a trance and something happened to him psychologically. So he really was physically injured on the battlefield, but in his mind, the reason he was injured was because a star shot out at him from the Mark of Cain on Ava. Sinclair ends up next to, guess who, Demian, in this treatment area for wounded soldiers, where they really suddenly turn into this relatively melancholy state. They just keep reminiscing about old memories and kind of laugh off and talk cavalierly about things like the incidents with Cromer and others in a way that makes it seem like those weren't actually big deals in the grand scheme of things in their life. So they're kind of laughing off all the things they've been through together and reflecting. This is the scene where Demian tells Sinclair that he's going to leave him, that he's no longer going to be present in Sinclair's life in the very real feeling way that he has been before. This is when it hits home not just for Sinclair but for the readers, a reminder that Demian was just part of his imagination. And he says, "If you ever really need me or think you need someone like me or a motherly figure like Ava, we're just in you. We've been within you the whole time." Basically, they served as his guides through life, and then at the end of the story you realize that he basically was just, all he needed to go through life was himself and his own self-psychoanalysis, basically, but that manifested in the form of these imaginary friends of sorts. It's also noteworthy at the end that we revisit the Mark of Cain, because in the early chapters, the conversation they have about the story of Cain and Abel argues differently about it. The standard interpretation that the teachers were telling Sinclair about, that he just believed verbatim, was that the mark was a sign of evil and devilishness, and then Demian encouraged him to think of it as actually a good thing, like a badge of honor to wear that unique mark. And that evil was not just this catch-all term that he should blindly believe was constantly at play in this situation. Well, I'll explain that better in a little bit. But that Mark of Cain is relevant here, as well as just at the end of the day, how they were always by each other, but then suddenly Demian said he had to leave. The story ends with no real conclusion, and the war is not even over at the end of the story. Part of the reason might be because World War I was not over when the author was writing this, so maybe he felt premature to say who won the war, because clearly it was very much a fictional version of the actual war that was happening, and more symbolic at the end of the day, so it wasn't even about who won, it was about the fact it was a war. A war between ideas was the theme of the whole story, and then they go to a literal war. Other key symbols include, of course, Abraxas, who represents this yin and yang analogy, this type of good and evil, all combined into one character. And remember, that's the one that Demian tried to remind Sinclair about with the note that he left in his bag, that you have to break out of that egg as a bird to enter the new world, and Abraxas is where you will fly to. Basically, the bird is Sinclair. That's what Demian was alluding to, and the bird flies to Abraxas. There's also a fire symbolism, I think, there's this conversation Sinclair and Pistorius have where they had that fight, and they said that they were talking, quote, in front of a dying fire, like the spark of their relationship was dying out. There's a sparrow symbol that is key, because a sparrow is part of the coat of arms design above the front door of Sinclair's house, which he tries to paint. And later on in the story, at one point, Sinclair sees an image of a sparrow in the sky. He then continuously has a dream with a sparrow above his parents' house, ready to break free from it, because his parents' house kind of represents that childhood world that he is leaving. Lastly, there is the important symbol of the painting that Sinclair does, and he continues to do so in a way that makes him step back and realize he's painting Ava. Sometimes he also thinks it looks like he's painted Demian, and other times it looks like he's painted himself, which really is what scares him and freaks him out. And that's because, remember, at the end of the day, Ava and Demian are both Sinclair. They're different parts of him. They're in his imagination. They are all him. And when he understands that, I think he suddenly feels scared and alone, and that's why he has that psychotic moment where he has that mental breakdown after seeing the painting and seeing himself in it. Because he viewed himself as so mediocre, and he viewed his friends as so superior and superhuman and magical, and now to feel like the magic is gone and it's just him made him feel like he just lost something big. The key dynamics in this story I want to point out are, first of all, between Demian and Sinclair and Ava, the three of them, because of course, then there's Pistorius, who affirms his worth and helps him grow confidence-wise, but helps him grow in a different way than Demian would. But the two key moments that stand out in my mind are the ones where Sinclair is the one pursuing the others for guidance, not the other way around. So rather than be mentored, rather than be the mentee, he becomes the mentor. One of those moments is when he talks to Naur, the boy who is about to take his own life. But interestingly, you still see how Sinclair himself is emotionally immature and doesn't know how to grasp some heavy themes and topics yet, because he just sort of leaves that boy then. It's not like he spent his life checking in on him, seeing how he's doing. He does not have the same emotional bandwidth as Demian has clearly shown towards him. He doesn't do the same for someone else, which is really interesting, I think. Then there is the fact that he pursues Pistorius, the organ player, and goes to the bar with him and uninvited strikes up a conversation. I don't think the Sinclair we met at the very beginning of the story would do that bold thing. Now let's go over BTS's Wings/You Never Walk Alone era, where they had this series of music videos with monologues and different symbols throughout those music videos that are very much reminiscent of what we just talked about happening in the Demian stories. I'm going to start by just reading you the key details in monologues. I'll skip around a little, but read the monologues for part 1, part 2, etc. And then after I read the monologues, I'll go through some of the actual action in symbols throughout those videos. Then you will see the big picture, and we'll tie everything together, and I'll share my favorite quotes from this book and how they apply to the bigger picture that BTS is telling, as well as the bigger story that Demian is all about. So here are the direct monologues from the BTS Wings videos, starting with chapter 1, of course. The realms of day and night. Two different worlds coming from two opposite poles mingled during this time. My parents' house made up one realm. This realm was familiar to me in almost every way. Mother and father, love and strictness, model behavior in school. It was the first fissure in the columns that had upheld my childhood, which every individual must destroy before he can become himself. Such fissures and rents grow together again, heal, and are forgotten. But in the most secret recesses, they continue to leave and bleed. The other realm was completely different, a loud mixture of horrendous, intriguing, frightful, mysterious things. With a face that resembled her son's, timeless, ageless, and full of inner strength, the beautiful woman smiled with dignity. Her gaze was fulfillment, her greeting a homecoming. Silently, I stretched my hands out to her. My scene was not specifically this or that, having shaken hands with the devil. The devil held me in his clutches. The enemy was behind me. The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Who would be born must first destroy a world. The bird flies to God. That God's name is Abraxas. He too was a tempter. He too was a link to the second, the evil world with which I no longer wanted to have anything to do. So he's basically telling the story of parallel worlds. We have the world of good, purity, things associated with childhood and innocence and growing up and being taken care of. And then the other world is viewed as dark and rebellious and full of sinful things and things like that. Similarly, Sinclair's story starts where he is at his parents' house and he turns to them for comfort all the time, and he is just not exactly totally happy, but feels cared for in a way. He's just too scared to leave his house, but eventually that sparrow in his dreams over the house grows and grows and gives him the mental tools he needs to become his own person at university, at boarding school, etc. And he enters this darker, sinful world of going to the bars and all of that. But both times there are parts of it that he doesn't like. Remember, he eventually realizes he's irritable when he goes back to his parents and goes back to that childhood home. And then there are parts where he is angry and lonely and homesick. So in both environments, he's not entirely satisfied. And I keep going back to the thought of Abraxas, this character that he is gravitating towards, the bird flying to Abraxas. He's realizing that life is not all this or that. It requires that good and evil, that positive and negative together to be just life. The first video in this BTS series was Begin, and in Jungkook's video, he sees that self-portrait that a storm starts washing away. So it starts raining inside this room, and the picture eventually just bursts into flames. Basically, this picture is getting destroyed and demolished as Jungkook looks at it with fear, like that moment where it dawned on Sinclair that he had just been painting himself. And a bird ends up flying overhead in that video as well. Part 2 is called Lie, that's Jimin's solo, where there's text on the screen that says, "Please stop me and please guide me." Basically what Sinclair constantly wanted Demian to know. It also seems noteworthy that there's an apple in that scene, that apple that's not just stark because of the contrast, because Jimin's in this all-white room with the apple, but also because, remember, the bag of apples was what kicked off the whole story here. That was Sinclair's first big lie about stealing. Then Jimin ends up in this room where feathers are flying everywhere, like bird feathers, and there are flashes of memories like an apple and that bathtub. Remember, during that psychotic breakdown, Sinclair had that sudden decision to take a middle-of-the-night bath. Chapter 3 is called Stigma, and that is when V ends up vandalizing the wall and gets arrested and is just being extra rebellious. He's in that world of the evil forces, or however you want to put it. But we see for a moment in the pupil of his eye that image of a woman holding a baby. That figure becomes very common throughout BTS's story, that figure that's like Frau Eva, there to comfort someone. It's also interesting when the police are questioning V about the vandalism, he refuses to disclose his parents' names. He feels very ashamed and will not disclose his parents' names, what family he comes from, which made me think of how Sinclair didn't want to, eventually he stopped being interested in being associated with his childhood life at all, and was ready to cut ties with them. The main detail I would point out from Chapter 4, which is called First Love, is just that we do have that bathtub image that shows up in a quick flash. And the detail worth noting from Chapter 5, Reflection, is the tattoo that Namjoon gives himself, of a bird. Chapter 6 is called Mama, and that is symbolic for obvious reasons. Then we have the Wings interlude monologue, all about the bird flying to a god named Abraxas. Very fitting that the story starts with Begin, with the painting and everything, and then the other video with the most overt references to Demian is the last one, Chapter 7 again. In this one, called Awake, Jin opens up these curtains and sees a mirror behind them, like he's literally having to face himself now. He walks down the hallway after he sees himself and sees a picture of that bird framed on the wall. At the very, very end of that video, the Polaroid images that we see fade into the picture include that image of a mom hugging a baby, as well as a bird, an apple, and a few other symbols. All of this culminated for BTS in the Blood, Sweat, and Tears video, where again we see the flash of an image of a bird. Once Jin kisses the statue, all of the colors that bleed from it remind me of the colors that bled from the portrait that looked like a self-portrait after it started raining. So that's an original, unique twist on the story. There are a lot of themes that come up throughout Demian that are also themes that are coming up throughout BTS's storyline, not even just during those Wings films, but elsewhere too. There's the constant theme of divisions and overcoming them and the importance of friendship. In BTS's story, we of course have 7 sides to the story, and interestingly, in Demian, the story starts out with a prologue where the author talks about the importance of just hearing people out and not worrying about being this omniscient, impartial narrator. He actually criticizes authors who, quote, tend to take an almost godlike attitude toward their subject, pretending to a total comprehension of the story. basically arguing, hey, there are many sides to every single story. Yes, I'm an unreliable narrator, but aren't we all? BTS are constantly trying to legitimize and validate the feelings of the youth, bucking the status quo and trying to just go your own path and not just do what you're told blindly, but think for yourself is, of course, a big part of BTS's stories and many other themes we will get to. But here are the two most powerful quotes about legitimizing and validating the feelings of youth in Demian. The first one, quote, "I have no idea whether parents can be of help, and I do not blame mine. It was my own affair to come to terms with myself and to find my own way. And like most well-brought-up children, I managed it badly. Their childhood becomes hollow and gradually collapses. Everything they love abandons them, and they suddenly feel surrounded by the loneliness and mortal cold of the universe. Very many are caught forever in this impasse, and for the rest of their lives cling painfully to an irrevocable past, the dream of the lost paradise, which is the worst and most ruthless," basically arguing ignorance is the opposite of bliss, and having this happy-go-lucky childhood does nothing to prepare you for the real world, because then when you suddenly break free, you're ready to fly, you suddenly don't know where to fly, or how to fly even. It's the most ruthless of dreams because it's unattainable, unsustainable as well. One more, quote, "I realize that some people will not believe that a child of little more than 10 years is capable of having such feelings. My story is not intended for them. I am telling it to those who have a better knowledge of man. The adult who has learned to translate a part of his feelings into thoughts notices the absence of these thoughts in a child, and therefore claims to believe that the child lacks these experiences too. Yet rarely in my life have I felt and suffered as deeply as that time," unquote. That quote is so much reminiscent of the BTS storyline, of these moments where the BTS members are younger, things seem good, but then abruptly they're not again. And it's just a reminder that kids go through a lot. And that adults think kids should be just grateful, you have a magical life, what are you talking about? Enjoy childhood while it lasts, and that really belittles the trauma some kids go through, or just the emotional depths kids are capable of that adults sometimes underestimate for sure. And that's why they sometimes spoon-feed lessons to kids, thinking you can't understand a more abstract concept, but maybe you can, and that's what this story is all about. Both BTS's story and Damien's address these parallel worlds of good and evil, and realizing that there's not as clear of a line drawn between them as you might think. Quote, "You knew all along that your sanctioned world was only half the world, and you tried to suppress the other half the same way the priests and teachers do. No one succeeds in this once he has begun to think." Once that thought was provoked, suddenly Sinclair could no longer close the door and just stay in one half. He couldn't stay in just his parents' house that made up one realm, as BTS says. He was now in both realms. You can't just put that genie back in the bottle once you see the other side, and that you are only living in one realm and there are two that you can explore in life. One of the ultimate themes in BTS's work and this story is seeing the world in shades of gray. Not just believing things are good or evil, or you are having a magical life or a miserable one, or you have no future or your future is super bright. It's all about that ambiguity and that constant mix, and that categorizing things in certain ways is very limiting. This is where the influence of Nietzsche on their thoughts really steps into the spotlight. He was this philosopher who wrote this book in 1886 called Beyond Good and Evil, all about how you need to think beyond these binaries, beyond these categories. He argues in a very interesting way in that book that black and white are so limiting ways to look at the world, and that language itself is actually, he goes so far as to say language itself is very limiting, because then you suddenly say you are this personality type, or you are that type of person, and those words are very, very limiting because we all contain so many complexities and nuanced layers that are the language is just one tool to try to express that, but it's only expressing a mere fraction of who any of us truly are. So he basically critiqued any way of describing the world like the Cain and Abel story where it's good versus evil, this versus that, because that's not how anyone is. So he really critiques, even by name, a lot of philosophers that came before him and described the world in that way, saying that there needs to be what he calls the new philosophers that step up to the plate, that embrace different things, like creativity, and a creation of their own version of new values. Not just new ideas, but a totally new framework for looking at the world and each other. He argues also that past philosophers focus too much on finding the truth, and that they need to focus less on truth and more on accepting the fact that life is all about untruths. Which is interesting when you think about how this story starts with an unreliable narrator. It starts with that acceptance of the fact that there are so many sides to every story. And he ends that book with a brief ode to friendship. The importance of camaraderie, the importance of not boxing people into categories, those are themes that are super prevalent throughout BTS's songs and videos. This is what I think about when people wonder why BTS has that love yourself era, saying you can only be loved if you love yourself first. And some people say that's not really the right way to look at it. You are worthy of love regardless of whether or not you love yourself first. And I think the focus is too much on the order of those things and not the fact that both are a continuous process. Members are in these harrowing situations in the videos, but they help each other out and they help themselves. It's always both happening together, and the order is not important, the term you use is not important. Language is just a very limiting way to look at that journey of self-discovery and acceptance, and that is what they get. They get the complexity of that, and that's what they're really showing us. I think a very thought-provoking quote is, if you hate a person, you hate something in him that is a part of yourself. What isn't part of ourselves doesn't disturb us. What really doesn't sit well with you must also be a part of you. Maybe the people you are angriest at, you're angriest at because something deep within you resonates with them and you're mad that it does. There are some really great quotes in this book as well about how it is truly radical to be an individual entirely. It pays so many dividends to do so. Quote, I realize today that nothing in the world is more distasteful to a man than to take the path that leads to himself. One more, quote, we who bore the mark, like the mark of Cain, felt no anxiety about the shape the future was to take. All of these faiths and teachings seemed to us already dead and useless. The only duty and destiny we acknowledged was that each of us should become so completely himself, so utterly faithful to the active seed which nature planted within him, that in living it out, its growth, he could be surprised by nothing unknown to come. Basically saying, hey, if you just accept the fact they're telling you you have that mark of Cain, wear it as a badge of honor, and then don't fall for a self-fulfilling prophecy. Prove them wrong. Like when Sinclair proved them wrong by proving that the bully Cromer actually didn't have any control over what happened to him. You just have those moments where you're like, hey, actually, I don't need to listen to you. I don't need to assume and just accept this as my fate. A lot of the things we've been taught to think as a dichotomy are actually compatible. And the story talks about how we need both camaraderie and a sense of confidence that we can do things on our own. Often one will help you with the other. Your independence and confidence will help you find friends, and those friends will help you gain the confidence to do stuff on your own. And so that yin and yang situation is a big part of this story. There's a really interesting quote from the book that says, quote, she stood before him and surrendered herself to him, and sky, forest, and brook all came toward him in new and resplendent colors, belonged to him, and spoke to him in his own language. And instead of merely winning a woman, he embraced the entire world, and every star in heaven glowed within him and sparked with joy in his soul. He had loved and found himself. But most people love to lose themselves. Nietzsche was always talking about how there's no clear-cut definition of anything and that reality is a social construct. And we are all too quick to forget categories that we needed to put ourselves and each other in. We forget that we created those categories and have the tools within us to dismantle those categories and those ways of thinking. He writes a lot about a will to power, which I find really interesting when he says, quote, do you know what the world is to me? Shall I show you in the mirror? This world, a monster of energy, without beginning, without end. This is my Dionysian world of the eternally self-creating, the eternally self-destroying. Super reminiscent of BTS's Dionysus song, as well as the fact they talk about that you have to break free of this world before you enter the new world. This keeps happening. It's without beginning or end. Again, beginning and end are treated like a binary when they're not. I want to leave you with two final quotes. Love must not entreat or demand. Love must have the strength to become certain within itself. Then it ceases merely to be attracted to attract. Made me think of how Sinclair first had to have other people come to him, and then he began to attract others and found a role in their lives, like with Pistorius, starting up that conversation and helping Naur before he hurt himself. Quote, "One never reaches home, but where paths that have an affinity for each other intersect, the whole world looks like home. Home is where you find that camaraderie, because within that then you can find your individuality," which again feels ironic, but the whole story to me is about all of these ways we've been taught to think of growth as linear, of success as narrowly defined, of relationships as being either good or bad, of things being this or that, is just not the way to see the world, and we need to just totally upend that. What happens in the Wings videos is less narrative driven and more symbolic. There's never a clear endpoint for their story. There is that somewhat of a conclusion with the Blood, Sweat, and Tears video, the statue breaking, etc., but it breaks to form something new that will start the story over again in a way. This story is ultimately about parallel worlds of good and evil and how they merge throughout your life. You may never be truly satisfied with either of them, but with the help of others, and then in turn with the help of yourself, towards yourself, once you face yourself and let others in, that mix of influences will lead you down the path you're destined to go down, help you follow where your soul calls you to go. There are different fan theories floating out there about which BTS characters represent which characters in this story. The scenes where Jimin's getting shoved in the bathtub are reminiscent of Cromer harassing Sinclair. There are the girls in the Love Yourself videos where she could be like the Beatrice. There's the Frau Eva figure, the motherly figure we keep seeing throughout the story. Sinclair could be Jungkook because he was staring at himself in that portrait, but it could be another member too. And they realize at the end of the day that sometimes what they imagine was just a dream. It's blurring the lines between dream and reality and coming out the other side, being happy and satisfied with the influences you took from both worlds and mixing them to create your own world. At the end of the day, this is a coming-of-age story, which BTS has always been about, being a voice for the youth and helping us be voices for ourselves and each other. Remember, we're called the BTS Army. Representative MCs for the Youth is part of that acronym. We are MCs for the youth. We are here to feel like our feelings are deep and validated, because the traditional way of defining the mind of a child is not true. The traditional definition of defining growth is not true. And again, this is what this author is always saying, and what Nietzsche, an inspiration, is also saying, where he's critiquing the way of thinking so much about truth, when it should be more about accepting untruths. That's what life is more about. And those untruths require unlearning and undoing those clear, boxed-in definitions. There are a lot more ruminations I have about this story, but hopefully I've just left you in a lot of thought and encouraged you to read the whole book for yourself, because it's really interesting. And of course then go rewatch the BTS Wings videos to see what I mean, because there are probably more Easter eggs that I haven't even picked up on yet. So many layers to this story. Not going to tell you which story is next in my BTS literary marathon of episodes, but just stay tuned because I'm very excited about it. So thank you for listening to today's. The next one will probably be a bit shorter and focus more on the quotes. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you all again very soon.